The era of early modern philosophy, beginning with René Descartes, largely concerned itself with the relationship between the mind and the world. One topic of discussion was the correspondence between what we perceived and what the world was outside our sense organs. John Locke, for example, distinguished the primary and secondary qualities of an object, the primary being those that are real and belong to things in themselves, such as extension, and the secondary being those that are not real, only relations between the subject and object, such as smell. And then there was George Berkeley's famous question: if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? To which he responded, no. His topic culminated with Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, in which he proposes the philosophy of transcendental idealism. This is the notion that all objects are inevitably bound by the understanding, the faculty of the mind which processes them in the universal qualities of space, time, and the categories of thought, which are basically relations between the various fragmented sensations that we take in. As such, everything we perceive, including both of Locke's primary and secondary qualities, are empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. We cannot say anything of their existence outside of our perception. So to Berkeley's question, Kant will reply by throwing his hands up in the air. Despite Nietzsche's severe criticism of idealism, his denial of the possibility of knowledge in itself, and his call for the need to destroy idealism as a concept, Nietzsche's theory of knowledge, Perspectivism, follows in the footsteps of Kant's transcendental idealism, and Nietzsche is best understood as an ontological idealist. The first statement is supported by the fact that Nietzsche espouses the idea of a creative faculty which filters sensory information into forms, very much like Kant's understanding, but Nietzsche adds an evolutionary twist to this. The second is supported by the fact that Nietzsche provides an account of the thing in itself. He believes that there is a dissimilarity between what we perceive and what is, and explains how this is so. But as we will come to understand, Nietzsche's thing in itself is a realm of perspectivity and inscrutability, which removes the concept's significance and defers our interest to appearance, and only appearance. And by removing the ability to grasp a thing in itself, Nietzsche eliminates all the moral implications associated with idealism, which he so hated, specifically ressentiment and the denial of life. In this episode, I will discuss Nietzsche's theory of knowledge, Perspectivism, but because it is so complex, I've opted to split it into 2 episodes. As I said in episode 1, Perspectivism is the transformation of the world into forms according to the needs of the organism. The forms include simplification, omission, and reinterpretation. This episode will cover simplification, whereas the next will cover reinterpretation. Omission was touched upon in the first episode, so it won't have its own episode, but we may refer to it here and there. If there is one takeaway from all of Nietzsche's philosophy, it is that all truth, including knowledge and moral sentiments, are conditional. The belief that we are disposed to perceive the world for what it really is, in some objective and singular manner, is a product of the belief that God provided us with the means to perceive it. Rather, with the elimination of theism and the introduction of natural selection as shaping the faculties of knowledge, the very ability to perceive the world presupposes a reason for perceiving it. As such, the world was conditioned according to that reason, most importantly, according to the drives that compose the organism: power. But before we dive into Nietzsche's Perspectivism, we must first understand his ontology, the idea that the world is the will to power. There are 2 passages that best describe Nietzsche's ontology, both of which come out of his notebook. There is Will to Power 1067, which reads, "And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. A firm iron magnitude of force that does not grow bigger or smaller, that does not expend itself, but only transforms itself. As a whole, of unalterable size, a household without expenses or losses, but likewise without increase or income. Enclosed by nothingness, as by boundary. Not something blurry or wasted, not something endlessly extended, but set in a definite space as a definite force. And not as a space that might be empty here or there, but rather as a force throughout, as a play of forces and wave of forces, at the same time one and many, increasing here and at the same time decreasing there. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flood of its forms." And then the more concise Will to Power 636. My idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space, and to extend its force, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies, and ends by coming to an arrangement, union, with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus, they then conspire together for power, and the process goes on. In both passages, Nietzsche is offering an account of his monistic ontology, the one thing that works behind the scenes of all levels of phenomena as its cause, like the archaea of the pre-Socratics, Plato's forms, and Schopenhauer's will. The world in its totality is an enclosed space of warring power centers, or will to powers. These power centers manifest as all levels of phenomena, from those as simple as physical forces to the more complex, such as biological and mental ones. Much is contained in this statement, which has to be broken down. The term will to power doesn't tell us much about what it really is. The best analogy to will to powers are the general mechanistic forces which our contemporary scientists believe constitute the world. But Nietzsche revises these forces a bit in that they are no longer law-like and aim for something, power. Now we have to narrow exactly what power is. While what is considered power differs by level of phenomena, in general it means to be master over other forces, to incorporate other power centers so that they work in one's service. Whichever power center is dominant in this war of will to powers transforms the weaker power center into units, and subordinates it into a hierarchy and division of labor. Hence, the privileged position of order of rank and coordination throughout Nietzsche's writings. To understand this, think of how a predatory animal consumes and digests another animal so that it can grow and be able to do the same to others. The consumed is broken down into units of energy, which help to sustain the work system of the animal and grow its body. This form of defeating and taking control of a being, digesting it so as to make useful units, and absorbing it in order to grow, manifests across all levels of phenomena. From Nietzsche's writings, we can surmise that the more a power center grows by incorporating other power to it, the higher along the levels of phenomena it moves. So a power center with less power under its control would manifest as a more basic phenomena, like a physical force, whereas one with more power under its control would manifest as something more complex, such as an organic or mental event. Nietzsche does not explicitly state this, but we can extrapolate from his writings. Moreover, the so-called sea of forces is not a multiplicity possessing distinct individuation or thingness, but a series of processes, just like Heraclitus' world of becoming, which is the only metaphysical account that Nietzsche is fond of. This is where we get into the inscrutability and perspective nature of the will to power. Power centers should be only thought of as momentary expressions of power with whatever other power center it is in contact with. They should not be thought of as storehouses of power, as that would imply that they possess substance or thingness. Power centers are strictly conditional relations between itself and other power centers they oppose. From this emerge the properties of the world that we perceive, such as the redness of an apple. Thus, a power center cannot exist in isolation. There is a sense of emergence present in this idea, in that power centers only arise from the relations of opposition. Again, this is a Heraclitean idea. As Heraclitus says, war is the father and king of all. Thus, because thingness does not exist, but only properties do, there is no subject-object distinction, or cause and effect distinction. One passage helps to clarify this idea. In 561 of the Will to Power, Nietzsche says that we form the notion of thinghood or substance by bundling its properties with one another, much like Hume, Locke, and Kant said. But here, Nietzsche is using it as an objection to the reality of the concept of thinghood, saying rather that it is a non sequitur to sum up the latent properties of an object and create a thing out of it, and then call it the cause of each individual property. So for example, say we have an apple before us, with all its properties, such as its red color, its sweet smell, its round shape, its smooth exterior. Nothing other than these properties are present, and yet out of them follows their union, which we then attribute as causally necessitating each individual property, such as its taste, when we bite into it. All of these properties are not in themselves united into the notion of the apple. Rather, it is us, one type of perspective being, who bundle these events into the unity which we then attribute with the name apple, much like Kant said in the Critique of Pure Reason with the category of substance. The world in itself consists of disconnected properties which, depending on our drives, we connect together like we do with the stars of a constellation. There's nothing intrinsic connecting the properties of an apple together, but only our perspective. This is what Nietzsche means when he says to stamp being out of becoming. It means to form rigid schemas out of a nebulous world. And we not only do this of the external world, but also of ourselves. The subject is just as much a false unity as any other object. In itself, the ego is in flux, just like the rest of the world. A community of power centers which are organized according to the division of labor and hierarchy, and whose parts are arising and dying. At the very best, the conscious ego is a mouthpiece of the various psychological drives that vie for their expression through us. There is no persisting self, even though we perceive a continuous unity since as long as we can remember, only the illusion of a persisting self. In fact, Nietzsche even allows for the possibility of a person being composed of multiple egos, which succeed one another every so often. Various will to powers would compete for control of the seat of the ego, and each will to power which succeeds in supplanting another would phenomenally manifest as a change in our values or mood. The only legitimate grounds for individuation in Nietzsche's ontology are the allegiances and oppositions in the war of power centers. As I just mentioned, power centers are a union of forces that possess a hierarchy and division of labor for the cause that it is laboring in. When one power center works in service of another, such as the various divisions of the body which work in service of self-replication of the genes, then we can conclude that they are united. But again, we must refrain from attributing the category of substance to this. At the very most, it's a vector. Now, you might be wondering why we don't perceive the world for what it truly is. The answer to that, again, returns to Nietzsche's ontology. We simplify what is manifold. The reason that we perceive these false unities is because they are useful to the organism in an evolutionary sense, and were naturally selected like any organ of the body. In the previous episode, I said that Nietzsche believed that the conscious and thinking subject is not the sum total of the organism, or mind, only appendage of the two. But I never stated how it was an appendage, so let me explain. Nietzsche hypothesizes that consciousness evolved in service of our social nature. He believes it's a kind of terminal of the organism needed to disseminate information to others, such as I am doing right now. So given the whole community of power centers of the organism, we are only its mouthpiece, and the form or language of this terminal is thinghood or substance. The world as it truly is, a world of becoming, is at odds with the ability to communicate, so consciousness must falsify the world into persisting and rigid unities in order to be able to convey knowledge to others. Some past ancestors of ours may have had a very chaotic phenomenal experience of the world, specifically with no unities and contradicting thoughts occurring at once. But with due time, these types of perspectives were naturally selected away, because they weren't conducive to their will to power. Think of consciousness as a mailbox. In order to send and receive information between the mail system, the information must be arranged into a standardized form, namely a stamped envelope, in order to fit through the slot of the mailbox and to be sent and received by the recipient. In short, knowledge and thought are limited by language or schemas, a concept known as linguistic determinism. Or, in more metaphysical terms, consciousness construes the world of becoming as a world of being. In effect, consciousness, thinking, knowledge are all intertwined to mean the same thing in Nietzsche's philosophy, namely the schematization of the world, or the stamped being out of becoming. So let's tie everything together. Perspectivism begins with Nietzsche's ontology, the idea that the world is a war of forces that try to impose themselves upon each other. Substances and things like an apple do not exist in this world, but only their properties, which are a product of two or more power centers interacting with one another. Perspective beings, such as ourselves, obviously do not perceive a flux of properties, but rigid and persisting objects. This is a falsification on our part, because it's the form of consciousness, and it's the form of consciousness because consciousness serves the role of disseminating information to other members of the species. This concludes the first part of our discussion on perspectivism. In the next episode, we will continue to draw on these concepts and understand how perspective beings reinterpret the world. Please let me know your thoughts of the episode by liking or disliking and leaving a comment. Again, if you are interested in the topic of perspectivism, I encourage you to go to the primary text, which is predominantly Book 3 of The Will to Power. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you, and see you all next episode.